This week, happy to introduce Kate Freeman from Penn State University, who's going to be talking with us about fire, biomarkers of fire, the paleo record of fire, which is a pretty cool thing to be able to reconstruct in the past, if you think about it, and obviously quite relevant today. Kate's got her bachelor's from Wellesley College, and then did a master's and a PhD with John Hayes at Indiana University, Bloomington. She has, for many years now, kind of been at the forefront, a pioneer of the use of biomarkers, and particularly isotopic ratios of biomarkers, individual compounds you can extract from the sedimentary record, to reconstruct all manner of Earth system processes and conditions in the past. She's looked at climate, she's looked at carbon cycling, she's looked at ancient ecologies and metabolisms, all kinds of fun stuff that if you know the right thing to look for and you can pull it out of the rock and measure it, you can really tell some very specific things about conditions in the past. Kate's really amazing for a number of reasons, one of which she's one of these scientists who's equally at home strolling through the dusty badlands, picking up samples, digging holes in northern Wyoming, which I've had the pleasure of doing once or twice with her, as well as sitting down and running extractions in an ultra clean lab. She could do both. I think she gets a kick doing both, and both are kind of cornerstones of the work that she and her students and collaborators do. She's developed an amazing record in the field. She's a fellow of pretty much every society and organization that you could name for a geochemist to be a part of, AGU, the Geochemical Society, GSA, and the National Academy of Sciences. And I guess, beyond just that kind of recognition, another thing I think that's notable about Kate is that she's really been an excellent and prolific mentor within the community. There's a whole diaspora of organic biogeochemists who have come through Penn State over the last many years, worked with Kate in one form or another, and have gone on to really kind of establish themselves as field leaders in the interim. And Brenda and I can even claim a little bit of help and mentorship from Kate along the way, certainly. I guess I remember sitting in a cafe in Prague, trying to figure out whether we were going to move to the University of Utah, making lists of pluses and minuses, and Kate coming by and sharing a glass of wine and asking us just simply what sounded like the most fun thing to do. And ultimately, I think that was one of the pivotal things for us, deciding to make the move. So thank you, Kate, for your mentorship and advice. And I'm looking forward to the talk. Take it away.
Oh, Gabe, thank you for that very generous and gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to join you folks today and to be able to share some of our recent findings. The flight out to Utah was very comfortable, and it's amazing how quick the commute is these days, so I'll be home by dinner. And thank you all for joining in and listening. I know it's a particularly stressful time. We were just talking about that during the meet and greet, and so I just want to acknowledge that and thank you for taking time out of a difficult and challenging time to be here today and to listen to what I have to say. So thank you. I'm going to share my screen so we can get these slides up and running. It's something I should be able to do since I do this daily for teaching, just like many of you. And let's see, I'm going to pull up faces so I can see people. So you should be able to see my slides and holler at me if that's not the case. But let's see. The talk today is on wildfires and environmental upheavals in the Cenozoic. And sorry, I'm just trying to get a little movement on my screen here of something that's in the way. There we go. And so I'm really very excited to share with you some it's been quite a journey of trying to figure out how to take these molecules and listen to them and learn the stories that they want to tell us about past environments. And I feel like we've made some really nice progress. So I'm going to share a couple of, several narratives about fire and climate change or other forms of environmental kind of turbulence or upheavals. And let's see. Why is that? There it is. Okay. And so fire, as many of you know, is kind of part of the landscape in many parts of the world. It's also not an insignificant part of the global carbon cycle. It's certainly observed and monitored sort of in global compilations. It's not quite 4% of net primary productivity is burned every year, returning carbon back to the atmosphere. Some of that's certainly changing as climate is changing fairly aggressively across the globe. Most of this carbon return is taking place in the tropics, particularly in the savannas, which you can see in this recent compilation are shown sort of in the African regions and in parts of South America, where there's fairly elevated emissions as measured in grams of carbon per square meter per year. So that's a particularly interesting geographic region to me, and ecologically it's very important to many humans on the planet, of course, but it also was just important in the total net fire component of the carbon cycle. Organic geochemists have long been interested in fire and ways to track it in the past, and indeed in the modern environment. So there's a very active community of folks who study products from combustion. The kind of suite of chemical signatures was named the so-called Pyrocarbon continuum by John Hedges and his co-authors some years ago now. And I'll just show you with my mouse. There's kind of a continuum of really wood-like structures all the way to very non-wood-like structures, sort of graphite. So when they coin this term of continuum, they're really talking about order to a very relatively disordered to more ordered structure. And some illustrations of sort of less ordered and more ordered structures are shown there just to illustrate that. But along with this charcoal and soot are also produced these individual compounds that are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And they are very important combustion products. They can travel fairly long distances, both in smoke particles and in soil particles by aqueous transport. So they end up in the rivers, they end up in soils and rivers and in the air. And they are also a pretty common contaminant from fossil carbon sources like petroleum or coal. And so the environmental literature is just full of information about these molecules and how to detect them and what they might tell you. And I'll just point out that there's a couple of things to notice here. This is anthracene here is a 3-ring carbon, so is phenanthrene, but this has a kink in it. So it has a kind of a different shape than its neighbor here, even though they both have 3 rings. And the one over here on the far right, which is retine, is also a 3-ring structure, but it has a little TV antenna on the right and what's a methyl group here on the other side, looks like a nose or something. And these branches that are formed also convey source information. So we have shapes that tell us something about how fast these things were made. Size tells us something about the mode of transport. And then these branches or alkylation tell us something about the origin or the source. So there's a lot of information encoded in this that's been, the topic of studies by our colleagues in the environmental chemistry field for many years. They're priority pollutants for EPA and have been for a long time, for example. So we've been working on at Penn State over the last few years is sort of learning how to take that environmental information and rethink it in terms of long records and past environments. And I'm going to share with you stories using that kind of information for 2 very different kind of upheavals, if you will. The first is work of Alison Karp. I should say Dr. Karp defended her PhD in January, back when we could still do it in person. And she is now a postdoc at Yale. And her studies focused on the rise of C4 grasslands about 10 to 6 million years ago or so, maybe a little bit younger in some places. And was there a fire component to that transition, a major ecological transition? And then going back a little bit further and maybe a little bit wilder in terms of our interpretive understanding of things, we'll look at the end of the Cretaceous and the beginning of the Paleogene, which was marked by this major impact, as an artist envisioning of that here, that happened to hit in the Gulf of Mexico. And so there's a lot of really interesting studies that go back over 30 years of fire-related or combustion-related carbon compounds associated with that event, and we're going to try and make some sense of those records. So just to remind you that these molecules today come from two main sources. They come from biomass combustion. This is from a fire last year in California. Of course, they've been very devastating this year, and I want to acknowledge there's been a fair amount of death and destruction associated with wildfires. In addition, they also are associated with contamination from fossil fuels. Here's the Deepwater Horizon, which is kind of an iconic figure now from the accident that happened in 2010, a blowout, and then a massive oil spill. And so there's PAHs being released in the environment through the smoke cloud of combustion, but also directly into the water column through the oil that leaked out of the top of the wellhead for so many days. And so they're introduced into the environment in a variety of sort of physical mechanisms. But there's a third source of these compounds. So these are the ones that the environmental chemists tend to focus on. But as a geologist, I've actually come to realize that there's another source that we really need to pay attention to, and that's the recycling of carbon from sedimentary deposits. And that carbon has been heated through its journey in the geologic basin to kind of create kerogen. It's kind of like coal, but distributed through the sediment, so it's not economically particularly useful. And so I've marked, in case you're wondering where I'm from, this and where I am at the moment. This is Penn State is here in the center of Pennsylvania, and we're in a fairly thermally mature belt of the Appalachians. The anthracites are off to the east, and then the less mature coals are further west. And so this is for both terrestrial deposits such as coal and marine deposits, which give us kerogens. This outcrop on the upper right is the Marcellus Shale, famous for its production of gas through fracking, which apparently is a topic of active debate amongst our politicians even today. But down in the lower right is one of the favorite outcrops of geologists at Penn State. It's on the road between our town, State College, and Harrisburg, the next closest reasonably sized city. And you have to be careful when you're driving this route and not drive yourself off the road because the outcrop is so cool. But you'll see in here, there's all sorts of little thrust and faulting things happening. But what I like about it is this organic rich horizon that's so prominent. And those are part of the Devonian shale sequences. So we have this kerogen is itself as thermally mature, refractory in that it's not easily biodegraded, and it is a source of these compounds through weathering processes. So as we think about these sources, fossil carbon, either catastrophic through combustion or through the slow process of weathering, and then the biomass combustion, which is what we're interested in from if we're doing a paleoecology study. So to try and source these things out based on structures of the molecules, this is just an example of phenanthrene. Again, I pointed this out earlier in the slides. You can see this one has a nose here, this one has two, and this one has three. And these are branches of carbon or methyl groups on these structures. And the number of them, it turns out, are really diagnostic for their source. And we can and this is just comes right out of the environmental chemistry literature. And biomass combustion from a plant source has a prominence of no alkylations and then decreasing amounts of compounds with alkylation based on the number of the alkyl carbons or the number of branches. Whereas petroleum sources or coal or other fossil carbon sources, they have kind of an increasing number of these compounds from no branches to 2 to 3. And then it kind of arcs over as you go into 4 to 6. And so this is something that we were pretty interested in, and Allison devised this little index, which is just a bit of calculus on the curve fit to these profiles. And so if it's convex or concave, and if it's rising or falling, is measured by the first and second derivatives of these things. And that allows us then to sort of show positive values are really strongly pyrogenic, and negative values indicate a fossil carbon source. So this is a source indicator that I'm going to use in some of these applications today. And then the other thing that we like to do with in my lab at least, is combine these studies of these fire compounds with other proxies, and in particular, leaf waxes is something that we've been using for quite some time. And these are long, waxy compounds that are on the surfaces of leaves. And they are well loved by organic geochemists because they carry both carbon and hydrogen. And so we can reconstruct something about isotope hydrology using the hydrogen, and something about plant physiology using the carbon isotopes. And that's long been around. I'll show you some data for that in just a second. And so we're starting now to add to that the carbon isotopes of the aromatic compounds, which tell us something about the fuel that burned to make them. So we can say, oh, did a C3 tree burn to make this fire compound, or did a grassy C4 plant burn? And that adds a whole nother dimension of information about fire and their fuel sources. And so here's just some examples of compiled data from a variety of publications you can see down in the lower left, with leaf waxes showing a really nice separation of a C3 source and a C4 plant source. And likewise, the burn compounds show that same separation. That's offset a little bit for reasons that we can understand, but the difference between them is similar. And so we can source these compounds and indicate something about fire fuel based on this. So the first sort of application of this sort of new toolbox that we've built at Penn State is to look at the rise of grasslands. This is a modern map. It's actually a couple decades old at this point, and I apologize, it's so pixelated on the screen. But it's an old slide, but it still really illustrates sort of the different habitats and expansion of grasslands today. And you see the savanna habitats here, and particularly pronounced in the continent of Africa. Also in Australia, you have open landscapes, and of course the steppe regions of Asia. So they're very important for lots of reasons. I don't think I need to explain all of that to many of the folks in the audience today. But one of the things that's really intrigued us is really building on Turi Serling's work, is, you know, the expansion of grasslands happened fairly abruptly at any particular location, but it happened kind of diachronously across the globe. And there's been a lot of speculation about the transition from woody to grassy ecosystems. And one of the suspected agents for this might be fire. Fire in ecological literature has a pretty interesting kind of combined set of feedbacks, where it can, of course, kill trees, which decreases forest cover, which increases grass cover. But grass itself has a lot of fire traits, and so it can actually promote fire. And so you have sort of stabilizing feedback loop, which can then be accelerated or pushed the system into by external forces such as a drought conditions. So it's often speculated that, or modeled even as shown by the Bierling and Osborne work that we're citing for this diagram, that an environmental perturbation can then be accelerated by fire sort of into a sort of a state change in the ecosystem. And then once it's in that new sort of open grassy ecosystem, the fire feedback stabilizes it. So it's pretty interesting kind of combined sort of pushing and then stabilizing of ecosystem change. So as many of you know, the rise of grasslands in ecological prominence is in the late Miocene. That's shown in the red sort of, looks like a paddle on a boat or something in this diagram. But there's also evidence of grasses, C4 grasses, that predate that significantly back into the Oligocene, including molecular phylogeny data, genetic data. But there's the prominence of them ecologically is a fairly abrupt transition that Turi has charted out for us early on, and continues to be a topic of fascination for many people. And there's a lot of kind of so-called smoking guns that are invoked for this. Some, and I think there's growing evidence that low CO2 probably was a precondition that set the stage. And then localized influences of changes in aridity or disturbance by animals or fire as a disturbance is often invoked. And so we're going to try and test that last one, see if we can see a fire signal associated with that rise of grasslands in different regions. And I'll look at two different localities associated with Asia, the Asian continent, and then one locality from Australia. So here's, this is work that dates back now many years. This is work that we published back in 2000, where we compared the C4 and C expansion record up here in the Cenozoic group in samples from Pakistan, and then compared those to here at the toe of the Bengal fan. These distal sediments have also a record of the same transition, and so the stuff that's in the fan is kind of collecting all of the terrestrial material and integrating it and giving us more of a continental picture, where the soils are really kind of in place, localized records. So certainly on the continental scale, in comparison to the fan, it's a fairly local record. So we have kind of boots on the ground and then kind of integrated semi-continental scale comparison. And these are the data from Lee Colarusso's master's thesis many years ago, and it shows a really nice transition between C3 signals before 8 million years ago, and then C4 signals by about 6 million years ago, and a little bit messy transition in the paleosols. May not be unexpected, given that it's sort of local variability in the environment and potentially the preservation of it. Whereas in the marine sediments, we get sort of a smoother transition, but we see the same sort of movement from a C3 signal into a C4 signal at that time. So this is older data, and we've been revisiting these same samples and these same localities to look for fire. And so that's what I'd like to share with you here. The figure on the left, we published a couple of years ago now. This is older information, but it is now complemented by the panel on the right. So the one on the left is from the Cenozoic group, that's from the paleosols. And what's plotted on the vertical axis is the total amount of these PAH compounds normalized to a plant wax. And that allows us to kind of account for changes in the amount of fuel or biomass on the landscape. So if you just have a lot of biomass burning, you get more of these compounds, but it doesn't necessarily tell you something about frequency or propensity of fire. It just tells you that there was more stuff to burn. And so we normalize for biomass using a plant compound like that, and that really helps us see these patterns. And the horizontal axis is the isotope value of the plant wax itself, and that shows us that transition from a C3 signal into a C4 signal on the right. And that this is, I want to point out, because I often forget to do that, but this is a log scale. So the change in the concentration of these fire compounds is orders of magnitude. It's not a subtle signature at all. It's a little messy in the Cenozoics, but it's not subtle. And the different color panels are chunks of time moving from prior to 10 million years ago, about 10 to 8 million years ago in the pale green, and then a transition period of 8 to 6, and then after that transition in the yellow. And so we see this really prominent association of fire compounds with the change in the isotope values indicating the ecosystem shift. The newer data on the right is similar in that we have, again, fire compounds normalized to a plant biomarker, but now we've cleaned them up a little bit more using those metrics for source that I indicated or introduced at the beginning of the talk. So these are just those compounds we think come from fire, and we get a cleaner signal from that. Again, it's a log scale, so we see orders of magnitude shift here. And now instead of the plant waxes, what I just love about this is that we're actually looking at the fire compounds themselves in terms of the isotope values. So we have C3 burning, we have intermediate values of a mixed ecosystem burn, and then we have a really prominent C4 signal in the fire molecules themselves. So we see a really nice transition, and what appears to be happening is that with the change in climate and the advent of grasslands, you have concomitant with it a change in fire frequency of a fairly significant jump, and then an even greater jump once the grasslands have established themselves. And so we, in this submitted manuscript, we interpret that as both the sort of the push and then the stabilization mechanisms at work in these time frames. So that's taking, you know, a concept from ecology that happens on sort of annual to decadal scales, and then trying to interpret it on a million-year time scale. So we'll see what the reviewers think, but it does suggest that there's an association of fire with the rise of grasslands. Let's see. So that's in Asia, Southeast Asia, and that that transition, this is a figure, by the way, from some nice compilation that Caroline Stromberg did. And in the yellow is the, or orangey colors is the rise of the C4 grasslands in that particular continent. And what I want you to take away from this figure is, and her work has nicely shown, that it doesn't happen at the same time in all these different places. The trigger gets pulled differently in different localities. And one of the ones that really contrasts with the sort of iconic transitions in South Asia is the Australian transition is much, much later. And it's about 3.5 million years ago, as opposed to sort of 8 million years ago, 6 to 8 million years ago. So that's really quite a departure in timing between those two. And those are two very different parts of the world. They have different vegetation pre-existing and after the fire, or after the transition. And there's some thought that maybe there's a difference in fire ecology of the pre-existing vegetation. So that's what we're going to look at now. And this is a recent work by Francesca McInerney at the University of Adelaide. She and her student Jake Andre published this really nice record from these cores located here on the sort of west of Australia, where they kind of are downwind of prevailing winds that carried a lot of material from the northwestern corner of the continent. And Jake's data are very much like I've been showing you, but he's plotted them here as percent C4. They're all based on plant wax isotope values. So the waxes of the plants are carried by the wind and deposited in these sediments, and then show this transition from not very much C4 on the landscape to a prominence of C4. And it kind of happens over this transition period, where the onset of it is about 3.5 million years ago, which coincides with the end of a cool or humid period and the onset of a fairly arid interval. And that aridity is really nicely shown by the aeolian flux mass accumulation rates, which show a really big rise in detrital material, windborne material from the continent. And so this drying of the landscape seems to be very tightly coupled with the rise of the grasslands or the C4 signal in Australia. And so we looked at the PAHs to see if they marched along in lockstep with the alkane isotope data like they did in Asia, and the answer is no, they did not. So on the very left panel, this is now the actual data that Andre measured. Jake plotted here as the individual compounds showing that transition to C4, starting at about 3.5. And right at that same time, instead of seeing a more fiery signal, we actually see a decline in the fiery signal. We see more of a petrogenic, is what we call a non-fire signal in the alkylation. And at the same time, even as these black circles show the lower values of the APDI index in that non-biomass fire source, we see a huge jump in their mass accumulation rate in the sediment core. So there's a lot of PAHs there, but they're not coming from wildfire. And then finally, this panel here is just a kind of a smooth profile of the dust as indicated by clay mass accumulation rates for the same localities. So clearly things are happening on the landscape. There's a big sort of pulse of detrital material that's getting swept off by wind, and associated with that is a big pulse of PAHs, but they're not from fire. And what we think they are is some kind of weathered material, and I'll show that in the next figure, which I just showed you. Now, can I go back? Yeah, let me go back. And what we think that the reason that the fire didn't facilitate the transition to C4 in Australia, in fact, we see kind of a hint at the opposite, but is that there was a pre-existing fire ecology, and this is, kind of gratuitous picture of macrofauna here, a little koala hanging out in a gum tree. The eucalypts are famous for their fire traits. They have resins in them that burn aggressively, but then they also can come back fairly quickly, as shown in this figure here, where this figure is 2 years after a pretty massive fire, and they sprout right out of the trunk, and they come back pretty quickly. And so they have a pronounced fire ecology. And so what we think is, and I don't want to go into detail here because there's more things I want to share with you, but this is a pretty interesting kind of case where the fire ecology preceded the transition, and so therefore it didn't really give an advantage to the grasses and may perhaps even kept them from expanding until the climate really was the driver. So it's a bit distinct from the Asian profile. But one of the things that surprised us with this record was that in that pulse of fossil derived kerogen or of PAHs, it didn't really look strictly pyrogenic. And so we used another technique to try and quantify the various end members. And this is called a non-negative matrix factorization. It's a technique that has been around for a while, and Pradika Polisar started using it for N-alkane profiles. And so he got us to take a look at it for our PAHs. So I want to shout out to Pradika for that great idea. And what we see in this sort of matrix deconvolution technique is that we get a pretty prominent weathered profile that is distinct from the pyrogenic and the sort of fossil-y petrogenic form. And that's this gray region right in here, really pushes out in the normalized distribution of these end members during that destabilization time. And what we think this is showing us in these gray is what is well known in the environmental literature, is that the methyl groups hinder ring activation by enzymes. So this is a compound, a pH here, that's going to be biodegraded. And the way that gets degraded is enzymes will attack or attach oxygen groups to them, and then that makes it vulnerable for the cleavage by the enzyme. And you see that in a couple of different mechanisms shown in this sort of cartoon. And the methyl groups get in the way of that. They literally block the enzymes from doing their degradation work. And so they tend to get kind of left behind. They're like the red Solo cups after the party. They don't get consumed. So they get left behind as the telltale of biological activity. And so what we're inferring is that this pulse associated with the terrestrial dust is weathered soil derived material that's being delivered, which is a pretty major shift. And so we can do some calculations to look at how much carbon was exported from the landscape associated with that pulse. And this is just some back of the envelope, sort of, if you sort of take an area and assume thickness of soil and use our pH mass accumulation rates to kind of estimate a burial flux, we come up with these numbers that are shown on the left, and they are pretty low before the transition. They begin to rise, and then in the peak of the transition, they go up a couple of orders of magnitude before sort of stabilizing in values that are pretty similar to what is actually measured for today. So this last one is measured, and the others are all just Allison and I sort of looking at the back of an envelope trying to make some math work for these estimated flux based on the mass accumulation rates of our compounds. And this is actually, there's echoes of this even today in Australia, and there's major dust storms. 2020 has been quite a year, as everybody knows. And you may or may not recall, but at the beginning of the year, there were these massive dust storms across Australia. And this is an iconic picture that was taken by an NBC reporter that shows that those dust storms kind of in a kind of catastrophic way across the landscape, and they were documented in satellite images of the continent as well. So pretty massive scale destabilization, and so potentially the opening of the landscape associated with this moment of changing and increasing aridity and ecological transition was perhaps also associated with massive destabilization and carbon loss from the soil archive and transition of some portion of that into the marine sediment. So that's an upheaval for you. So I thought we'd go to another upheaval, which is the end of the Cretaceous, when the non-avian, I've learned to say this, the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. These are two of my favorite cartoonists. And so for the students in the audience, if you're not aware of the genius of Gary Larson, you need to be. And Sid Harris has been around even longer, and he's a cartoonist that I've long found very funny in my own nerdly way. And so, but the image here of Gary Larson's cartoon is kind of iconic. It's the real reason the dinosaurs became extinct, is that they were secretly smoking cigarettes. Then I like the human mammal thumbing his nose at the end of the Mesozoic era and the demise of the dinosaurs. So that's what we're talking about. It's the time period when there was massive changeover ecologically on a global scale. And of course, that led ultimately to the rise of little furry creatures that became organisms such as ourselves. And this is not a subtle moment in time. It was pretty theatrical, and we know pretty well sort of the legacy of what happened. That this is an artist's envisioning of the crater of a bolide impact at this location on the Yucatan Peninsula, or what is the Yucatan Peninsula today. And this is some geophysical imaging of that crater. It's now subsurface. And this was the target for an IODP coring project not too long ago. So the Chicxulub impact crater was cored in the IODP ICDP Expedition 363, and it's site M0077. And you can see the sort of the ring structure here in this map, and the location of the drilling is here. Here's a cross section that shows the location of the core through a sediment pile and then into this really badly mangled bedrock underneath, and that's shown in the stratigraphic column on the right. And this environment is pretty wild. There's melts and crunched basement granitic rock, and then these swavites are catastrophic deposition of sedimentary material, probably tsunamis sort of sloshing in and out of the ring basin following the impact. So it's pretty amazing sedimentology, none of which I can take any credit for, but my colleagues, and I'm included on this, but the colleagues really captured these events in our paper called The First Day of the Cenozoic. And so envisioning pulling together all the evidence from a sedimentological and geochemical sources to sort of envision processes that were represented by these swavites, and then the onset of pelagic deposition. We just published a paper this week, in fact, on a companion study that builds on work that was first done by Wendy Wolbach 30 years ago. And Wendy, for her PhD at the University of Chicago, looked at the sort of iconic iridium boundary layer at a locality in New Zealand and showed a fair amount of soot was deposited. This, again, is orders of magnitude on the scale here. And so this big pulse of carbon was first charted, and they had some interpretations about it, whether it came from fire or other sources. And since that work, this is a compilation in the paper we just published, but it represents publications by many, many authors. And everywhere you see a red X is a boundary section that contains burn compounds. So there's soot or black carbon or PAHs, fullerenes, charcoal chunks, cenophores, which are kind of glassy bits of petroleum that have been spit out and captured. It's wild stuff, and it's everywhere. You can see sort of the global distribution of these burn markers, and it's literally global. And as many authors as are involved in this there are ideas about what they represent, and it's led to a pretty active debate, and what we call a hot debate, which is the source of these things. And the competing ideas include global wildfires, and I've shown you a satellite image of some of the fires in Australia last winter, or were they, when the bolide hit, it excavated a lot of sediments from the Gulf of Mexico. It today is a petroleum, economically a very important petroleum region. There's a lot of organic rich sediments, and even just sort of average Joe sediments in that environment have a fair amount of organic carbon in them. So maybe that was lifted up and redistributed globally as a source for these various forms of burn markers. The things that's kind of wild about this and gave Shelby and I some amusement is that the same molecules are argued from by different authors to support both of these hypotheses. So they're using the same carbon in both cases. So we thought, well, maybe some of our new insights that we've got from sourcing and process and transport can help us unpack the origins of these carbon, these burn markers at the KT or the KPG. So that the reason that we care about this is that there has really different climatic implications for the source of the molecules or the burn materials in all forms. If it's derived from a wildfire, here on the lower left, I'm pointing to this sort of, if it's coming from wildfires, that carbon mostly stays in the troposphere. But if it's coming from excavated target rock or stuff that was hit in the Gulf of Mexico by the bolide and then launched up. It goes up fairly high. It can go up tens of kilometers into the stratosphere and become climate active. And so the mechanisms of the influence of these carbon components in these boundary sections really differs depending on which source you're interpreting them to be representing. If they come from wildfires, they're really mostly invoked as representing fires that were drivers in the biomass, the terrestrial biomass extinction. There's a mass extinction, not only of, dinosaurs, but also of a lot of vegetation, big turnover in the types of dominant plant groups. And so these fires are mostly invoked as drivers for that extinction event on land. But whereas if they are from the target rock, that really represents a mechanism associated with what's called the impact winter hypothesis. And this actually dates back to Carl Sagan, some of Carl Sagan's work, that when you launch a lot of dust into the atmosphere, it cools the planet and darkens it and shuts off photosynthesis globally. And that's a driver for extinction both on land and at sea. So the mechanism really is tied to the source. And so you can see why people would squabble about where it comes from, because it has important implications. So let's see, I think I went backwards, so let's go forward. So I'm gonna I introduced this at the beginning, so I'll just make mention of it briefly here, that we're gonna use the shapes of molecules, whether they're kind of kinked and long or more compact, and kind of have this funny structure versus this very condensed structure. So the degree of condensation of them varies with how they're made. If they're made quickly, they're more loose and floppy. And if they're made slowly, they're more compact. And there's some thermodynamics behind that, as well as some kinetics. And so these chemists in the environmental literature have called these sort of looser forms the kinetic forms, and these tighter, more condensed forms the thermodynamic forms. We are attributing these structures as more representing weathered materials such as kerogens, and these kinetic forms as dominating or representing a source from something formed quickly. And that could be either combustion of biomass or rapidly heated sedimentary carbon in the target rock. So if it's coming from either of our two hypotheses, it would be represented by these forms. But if it's an input of background sort of weathered stuff, it would show these. And I'll just give you the upshot is that we see that it's mostly fast formed forms or congeners of the pHs. So we're going to look at not only the pHs from the impact site, but also a couple of distal sites to try and sort of begin to unpack a global pattern. And we want to ask three questions. Did they form fast? I already hinted at that answer. Do they come from fire, burning of biomass, or from pyrogenic sources petrogenic sources, meaning from sediments? And how are they distributed globally? How do they get to where they are? And to do that, we've been using the shapes, as I just indicated in the previous slide, the branching patterns that we see, which we used earlier, and then the size distributions actually tells us a lot about transport mechanisms potentially. So, and we'll do it for these three localities. And I'm just going to summarize this data. There's actually a fair amount of information here, but for the sake of time and digestibility, I'm going to try and summarize each of these, the proximal site and then the two distal sites together. The proximal site is the Chicxulub site itself. It's the M0077 locality. And what we find there is two things. First of all, this APDI metric, which is telling us, is it from fire or from a fossil source? It looks very strongly petrogenic throughout the section. And so we see really no indication of biomass in this section at all. And then we also, when we look at the shapes of these things, they look very strongly as if they were formed quickly. So they're associated with a fast process and a non-fire, non-biomass source. I also am not showing the data here, but there are also a full size range of these compounds is preserved here at this locality, representing probably rapid deposition, but also not very long transport distances. The longer that you transport these things, particularly in an aerial mechanism, you lose the heavier, the larger molecules, the less volatile, or they're associated with larger particles that fall out. So the smaller compounds are transported long distances. And in this locality, we have a mix of small and big, and that suggests that they weren't transported very far, consistent with this being the impact locality itself. So let's go to the distal sites. And here we see a little more nuanced information. And I'll start with this sort of simpler to interpret, which is that in both localities, we see strong kinetic signals. So these are really fast form compounds. There's no other sort of sources for these things other than some kind of combustion process. And then when we look at whether they were from fire or from a rock source, we see a mixture. And we see a pretty strong rock source here at site 1262 associated with the gray bar sort of indicates the boundary section. And then it becomes kind of a fire source or maybe a mixed source as you come out of that. So it looks like there's a rock source, and then, which would be sedimentary from the target rock, and then a fire source came in later. Site 738, which is over here, has a little more interest to it, or a little more texture to it, shall we say. It has actually a kind of a fiery signal early on, and then a massive change to a strongly petrogenic or mixed signal. So it's sort of starting fiery, and then it gets mixed in with a bunch of stuff that's not fiery. So we get these mixed components, and then it kind of, the concentrations go back down, and we see eventually sort of a fiery signal kind of returning. There is a background of fire signal probably at that locality that's ecological, possibly coming from the sort of wandering Indian continent there. So what we're seeing is that PAHs were formed fast, but they come from mixed sources. And from what we can tell, the stratigraphy of the impact horizon is complicated no matter where you look at it. But from the best that we can tell, the fire sort of was not the major source of them during the impact. It's post-impact moments that those are rock source and then maybe mixed in later with fire. And you see that most clearly in the 1262 site. Okay, so summarizing that, in the crater rim itself, it's just carbon from a rock source, a sedimentary rock source, and so we're interpreting that as target rock carbon only, formed very fast, exclusively petrogenic, so that's this target rock signal, and then this full range of molecular size, suggesting not very long transport distances, consistent with the locality. And then these distal sites, we see a target rock signal that's there very prominently, but there's variable inputs of fire, and it seems like perhaps there's sort of a delay in the fire signals. And so we see this, the evidence for this includes these fast forms, which I've already talked about, and this mixture of the alkylation patterns. And then what I didn't show you data for, but I want to mention, is that the pHs in these localities are really small. They're kind of skewed towards the smaller sizes, which suggests long distance of transport. So we're envisioning that the rock carbon got excavated, sent up into the stratosphere, and then was transported at long distances globally, and potentially within hours after impact. So pretty theatrical day in the life of our Earth. So it's really hard for us to estimate the amount of carbon from the pH data that we have, because we don't really have a good sense of the production ratio of how much carbon you started with how much pHs would be produced from that. So some of our co-authors did some simulations of ejected carbon bearing material just for comparison to see if the numbers kind of add up. And so assuming low velocity particles were deposited near the crater, I gotta go back, wait. And high velocity particles were carried as a dust, as I just described, and sort of assuming basic, not particularly organic rich horizons, about a 0.25% organic carbon in the pile of sediment rock that was excavated. The modeling suggests a fairly significant amount of ejected carbon, and of that, about order of magnitude less was turned into climate active soot by their model estimates, which would account for about 17 to 20% of the total soot based on the Wallback estimates. So it's not out of the realm of possibilities. And if we have to make up the difference, then that would suggest that maybe these wildfires kind of came in after the fact. So wildfires were not absent, but they weren't part of the moment of the boundary event, and they kind of came in afterwards, which is consistent with sort of the mechanisms that people envision for that, some of the ignition of those wildfires. So none of this is out of the realm of possibilities. It is, what it is, an estimate based on kind of a computational model of the movement of material as bolide came in at a 60-degree angle and a certain amount of carbon that was in the sediment pile to begin with. Okay, so I will just conclude here about the end of the hour. The PAHs are our newfound friends. Their characteristics distinguish both source and process, and that's a very powerful combination. They've helped us sort of untangle feedbacks related to grassland expansion in Asia and maybe some massive soil destabilization and carbon export associated with landscape opening and aridification in Australia sometime later. And then they indicate a significant sedimentary carbon released by the end Cretaceous bolide impact. And I put this chicken up because, of course, he's a survivor of the impact. The birds made it through, so it's a little dinosaur for us to look at. And then also because my friend and colleague, Mike Arthur, always refers to the work I do as working with chicken wire. And in fact, the PAHs do kind of look like chicken wire. So this is an homage to Mike. And his teasing of me. And so I'll just, one last thank you to you guys for being a great audience, our funding sources, and one more Gary Larson cartoon. The picture's pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we all have a brain about the size of a walnut. I'm hoping this is not a metaphor for our species, but there it is. So, and I will end with some chickens in central Pennsylvania and a sunset influenced by dust particles from, unfortunately, the fires in the western US. So that's my talk, and thank you. And I will stop the share so I can see you guys.